The first speaker is going to be Myrthe Bartels, who is at the moment a junior core fellow at the CEU Institute for Advanced Study. She specializes in ancient Greek political thought. And I think that this specialization really adds to the diversity of this workshop, because I think many of us, especially historians, maybe not the political scientists, we follow always different trajectories for conferences, workshops, depending on not our area of specialization, but the time, early modernist, and so on. So it really happens that we have an event where we have representatives of different periods. And Myrthe has her PhD from Leiden University in classics. And her research has focused on the political thought of Plato and Aristotle, and probably also several other subjects. And she has held fellowships and lived in the UK, Germany, Romania, and Italy. This is what I actually read out from this sheet that we were given as part of the conference dossier. But I've also read about her, probably on ORCID, that she has taught in 4 different languages. And I think that's also quite an achievement. After this technological intermezzo, then I would like to invite Myrthe to give her talk on what would an ancient democratic utopia have looked like. I don't know if people can see us. Yes. Okay.
Thank you so much. And first of all, I would like to thank very much the organizers, Zolt, Eva, and Darina, for their invitation to contribute to this workshop. As a classicist working on ancient philosophy, so as you may understand, this also comes with a bit of a challenge to my professional pride, since, of course, I feel that I'm under the obligation to say that, to show that ancient thought on democracy still has a real contribution to make to modern discussions. And I very much look forward to the papers over the next couple of days. So it has often been observed, so I'm going to read, I suppose, as quickly as possible, because we are supposed to stay within the 20 minutes time frame. So it has often been observed that while the ancient Greeks invented both the notion and practice of democracy, of which the Athenian democracy of the 5th and 4th centuries BCE is the most prominent and well-documented example, the extant ancient Greek texts that we would assign to political theory or political philosophy do not supply a systematic defense of the democratic regime. The major Greek texts on political thought are mainly engaged with the description of democracy as a phenomenon, with pointing out the surprising success of democracy, or with the ways in which democracy is deficient compared to the best possible regimes. The most famous utopian designs in our classical Greek texts, the better or even best possible cities in Plato's Republic and Laws, are not democratic utopias and generally treat of democracy in a very critical way. That does not mean, however, that some of the utopias that we do find in ancient literature do not present ideals that we would not hesitate to connect with democracy, most importantly, the idea of equality or even egalitarianism, which in political contexts is first and foremost associated with a democratic regime. That absolute equality between people was considered a hallmark of democracy may already be sufficiently exemplified by a no doubt provocatively intended remark by the 4th century philosopher Isocrates, not to be confused with Socrates, who writes in his Panathinaikos that Sparta is in fact more democratic than Athens, because Spartan citizens are more equal than the citizens of Athens, and he means more equal in terms of wealth, education, and social status. In this talk, however, I will not look at the ancient utopian texts, but I will rather look at what ancient sources have to say about what was wrong with democracy, and on that basis, work out a number of inferences for what might add up to a democratic utopia. And this is, of course, a highly speculative endeavor because the ancient evidence only takes us so far. I will draw on 2 groups of sources, both critical of democracy. First, moral assessments of the occupations of the demos in Democratia, moral considerations about those occupations, and considerations about inclusion or exclusion from citizenship on that basis. And second, Aristotle's hierarchical ranking of 4 different types of democracies, which offers additional suggestions about what sort of way to spend one's daily life makes one qualified and equipped to engage in politics in the first place and to be a good citizen. So my approach to the question of democratic utopia will be rather eclectic, in the sense that I will not be engaged with reconstructing the thought of one particular philosopher, but I will rather try to fuse evidence from different authors, in particular the 4th century authors Aristotle and Xenophon. Aristotle's Politics, in particular, is a useful source in the endeavor of constructing an ancient utopian democracy, a democracy that the ancients did not even imagine, even though Aristotle's ellipticism at times forces us to reconstruct the reasons and moral assumptions that underlie his classifications. And in particular, I shall focus on what Aristotle says about how citizens, those who partake in the regime and are responsible for upholding the political and legal order, ought to spend their time. This is because the question of citizen occupations is both central to this criticism of democracy that we find in the mostly elite philosophers writing in classical Athens, and because from Aristotle's considerations about citizens in the ideal city that he designs in Book 7 and 8 of his Politics, we learn something about what he thought was objectionable about those occupations. Now, some just clarificatory remarks. Since I use democratic in my title in the ancient sense of democracy, I should begin by saying briefly something about the ancient conception of democracy for the sake of disambiguation. As is clear from the name, democratia is the regime where the demos has the power, and that means the common people, that social group of citizens were non-propertied and less educated people who had day jobs, but who were numerically in the majority. So by sheer majority, the common people came to outweigh and prevail over the leaders and more wealthy property classes. In other non-democratic constitutions, the demos was mostly excluded from citizenship and hence politics. And that means that democracy is the distinctive type of regime in which the members of the demos do have access to the main deliberative and judicial institutions of the polis, of the city. In the terminology that is used, for instance, by Aristotle, is that they have a share in the politeia, the met eigen tes politeias, they have a share in the regime or the constitution. So to be sure, and contrary to what has sometimes been asserted by historians of ancient democracy, demos did not mean everyone or rule by the people or self-rule, although within democratic contexts it could later take on such a meaning. Democratia, a term which occurs for the first time in an inscription in the mid-5th century BCE, refers to what distinguishes democracy from other regimes. So this ancient conception of democracy is very much an empirical definition. Democracy is distinct from oligarchy, kingship, tyranny, etc., because the members of the demos were full citizens and therefore had access to the political and judicial roles in the city. In a monarchy or tyranny, those two functions would have been monopolized by a single ruler. In a democracy, on the other hand, these functions were accessible to all, including the demos. So for a proper understanding of ancient democracy, it is important to note that it is not only the political institutions as such that make a democracy a democracy. Athens is not just a democracy because there is a citizen assembly, an ecclesia. Non-democracies, including oligarchies, also had citizen assemblies. And the key question is therefore, who is allowed to speak in the citizen assembly? In Athens, the values and conventions of isegoria, equality of speech, and paresia, free or frank speech, gave every citizen an equal right to speak in the assembly, regardless of social and economic status. In Athens, the speakers are not the elite, but what is called ho voulomenos. Whoever wants to speak publicly is free to do so. The act of speaking publicly is not governed by status, but by the willingness to speak. Now, for thinkers such as Plato and Aristotle, who belonged to the social elite, the problem with democracy is not just, as is often asserted, that the common people lack the expertise of the more philosophical kind. The more fundamental problem is that democracy admits to power people who in daily life exercise occupations for making a living which they, so Plato and Aristotle, considered at odds with the tasks that citizenship consisted in, the virtues required for the ruling of the city and the passing of judgment. The non-propertied classes had to engage in paid work and work as laborers or day laborers to provide for their needs and livelihood, and these manual jobs are criticized as vulgar or debased. From the perspective of the elite philosophers, the fundamental problem with democracy is therefore that a vast contingent of people are citizens and therefore share in the regime that have access to legal and executive power, who, however, because of their daily activities, are simply not equipped and unqualified to exercise that kind of deliberation and responsibility. I will not read out the text, but at least you have it here on the slide. So what Aristotle here does is that he defines the citizen based on his capacity, the capacity needed to rule and pass judgment. Those functions require a certain excellence, but the lower, what he calls arete, but the lower working classes cannot be assumed to possess such excellence because their education and daily labor does not involve any of the activities that would deserve to be called virtuous. If the true citizen is the person who is capable of ruling, then for Aristotle, the political regime ought to reflect that and only include those people as citizens who can be assumed to have this capacity. And if, says Aristotle, the working classes are citizens, then the definition of citizen virtue should not be broadened so as to accommodate for those. In that case, the citizen's virtue will only need to apply to part of the citizenry. The problem with democracy is therefore that it brings to power people who are unqualified to rule. But then what exactly is wrong with these kind of occupations? In his design for an ideal city in Book 8 of his Politics, Aristotle criticizes what he calls the banausikai technai, often translated as the inferior professions. These are practically identical to the kinds of occupations that would be performed by the demos, by the working force. These kinds of occupations are limited in two ways. Those which are necessary for a citizen's education must be learned, but only to a certain degree, not so much as to make the person who learns them banasos himself. And I will just read the beginning of this text. A task and also an art or science must be deemed vulgar if it renders the body or soul or mind of free men useless for the employments and actions of virtue. Hence we label vulgar all such arts as deteriorate the condition of the body and also the industries that earn wages, for they make the mind preoccupied and degraded. Now, this is also the reason why the professions that earn one a wage ought not to be performed by those who are citizens in Aristotle's ideal city. By excluding these people from citizenship in his own city, Aristotle is excluding from the deliberating and judicial functions in the polis those who were precisely included in a democracy. His argument is that these occupations and some of the branches of education make the mind preoccupied and degraded. So Aristotle's discussion of schole, which is often translated as leisure, but which does not really mean free time in our sense, is fundamental to understanding this, because it's what you do with the time in which you're not working. So the ruling of the city and the passing of judgments are the things to be done precisely in that free leisure time. So they require time, they require a mind which is not preoccupied with cares and worries about the basic necessities of life. And we find a similar sentiment in Xenophon's Economicus, where Socrates is in discussion with the young man Critobulus, who wants to learn from Socrates how best to manage his estate. Socrates suggests that those people who are laboring in what he calls banausic occupations, like wage earning, have no time to devote to their philoi, their family, friends, associates, or to the city, and therefore are bad when it comes to dealing with friends and as defenders of the city. And he adds that in some societies, especially in those which dedicate a lot of their time to wars, citizens are not allowed to practice these banausicae techni, these vulgar arts. And this is actually also an idea that was echoed by Adam Smith in the theory of moral sentiments. So we now come to the second category of evidence. In the politics, Aristotle ranks 4 kinds of democracies, starting with the best kind and ending with the most inferior kind, based on a ranking of types of demos. So he distinguishes 4 kinds of demos, each is of a certain kind, and the democracy with the best kind of demos is also the best kind of democracy. And that is that is text number 4, which again I will not read out. The best kind of demos is the agricultural population, where the multitude lives by agriculture or pasturing cattle. The reason he gives for ranking this type of demos as superior is their lack of time and motivation to engage in politics. Second follows the agricultural community, where the people are herdsmen and get their living from cattle. And here the motivation is that the pastoral people are in a good condition to fulfill their military duties because they are well trained and used to living out in the open. And the lowest 2 kinds of democracies come to be when the demos consists of wage laborers and market people. Now, Aristotle does not say in so many words why a democracy in which the demos consists of small-scale farmers who are not very interested in politics is better than a democracy in which the demos largely consist of market people, or in any case where the population is such that those are the most likely to show up for assembly meetings. What he says is that this kind of life is inferior, and the occupations, so those people who spend their time in the marketplace or working for a wage, that those occupations involve no virtue. Elsewhere, Aristotle remarks that this 4th and lowest type of democracy is the one in which the demos is paid to attend to the affairs of the polis, so as not to lose the income from a day's work. The result is that the working classes are free to take part in the assembly, whereas the rich, who do have to take care of their private affairs, as a result, are not in the do not have the opportunity to attend, and therefore the result is that the multitude of those without property rather than the laws become sovereign over the regime. So Aristotle assumes a qualitative difference between the life of the small-scale farmer or herdsman and the people spending their time in the marketplace buying and selling or lending. The idea seems to be that whatever tasks and activities the agricultural life involves, it involves more of virtue than the occupations of craftsmen and salespeople in the market. So we see that according to Aristotle, there are certain professions that do not predispose one to governing, and these are the manual crafts that take place indoors and leave no time for leisure, on the one hand, and the commercial occupations of the market people on the other. Aristotle's elliptical comments may be supplemented by the discussion of estate management that we find in Xenophon, and which serve to suggest that as opposed to moneylenders, the good estate management, the good estate manager revolves management revolves around the realization of long-term goods. So while Aristotle does not say this with so many words, the inferiority of the occupations that he designates as banausic and the reason why they are not congenial to political engagement is that they predispose people to think only about the short term, to see each other in terms only of business partners in a short-term transaction, and not to see each other as fellows and part of a single whole. And as not as being part of a certain relationship. So the ubiquitously assumed parallelism between the management of the oikos, the estate, whence comes the term oikonomia, and the management of the polis would seem to further confirm the idea that the reason why democracy with the population managing farms is superior to a population spending its time conducting business transactions in the market. That are not about optimizing the use and preservation of resources and the setting of long-term goals. So how might we extrapolate, I'm almost there, how might we extrapolate from this to construct an ancient democratic utopia? I've speculated that what Aristotle does not make explicit, the criticism of the lower class crafts and commercial occupations such as buying and selling and retail trade urge people to be concerned with their private personal profit rather than with common benefit and a situation in which all participants involved profit. The problem with this is that they make people unable to think of themselves as part of a larger whole. So while Aristotle does not say as much, we may presume that farming means being interested in the preservation of one's wealth, including everything that belonged to the oikos, to the estate, including relatives, slaves, livestock, land for the longue durée, and the survival of the oikos, the estate as such. For Aristotle and Plato, this implies a fundamentally different mindset and a fundamentally different set of moral qualities than the qualities activated and trained, as it were, in the daily activities of buying and selling in the marketplace. To the mind of ancient Greek intellectualist thinkers, the latter occupations degrade the human mind, and this betrays a view of daily occupations as not just an innocent way of spending one's time, but as a kind of character formation. How you spend your time transforms your moral character, and an occupation makes you a particular kind of person. In this case, someone who is petty-minded and who cannot be trusted to think of the larger picture. Now, ancient intellectualist thinkers drew from this the conclusion that it was better to exclude such people from citizenship altogether. Yet we can also draw another conclusion, and that is that a democratic utopia à l'ancienne is a society in which the nature of labor is fundamentally secure rather than precarious and does not border on exploitation. This means relative security rather than the situation of the day laborer who struggles every day to make ends meet. While a democratic utopia does not mean that there needs to be absolute equality of wealth, it does mean that all citizens would need to attain a state of what the Greeks would have called plutos, which is often translated as wealth, but rather means comfortable prosperity, having secure sustenance and the security that the needs of oneself and one's dependents will be met not just tomorrow, but also 6 months from now, 1 year, 5 years from now. So ancient aristocratic thinkers chose to exclude the working and precarious classes on the grounds that they were unfit for engaging in politics due to their lack of moral excellence. That was the result of their social position. This was a moral choice. Rather than lifting poorer citizens out of this precarity, they thought it was better to exclude them. But I wonder what happens if we preserve their analysis but draw the alternative conclusion. This is to make sure that all citizens have both wealth, the prosperity or absence of precarity, and the leisure, the absence of time pressure spent on securing essential livelihood, to think about more than the bare necessities and how to make ends meet. So while the ancient assessment of democratia leads to a conclusion that for us is unacceptable, we may still want to take seriously the implications of their criticism of democracy, namely that reducing precarity and inequality and improving living conditions is the only way in which democracy could really work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know what happened to technology.
That must have been a power cut or something.
Okay, but we will proceed with our next speaker, Professor Ferenc Huoranszki, and we will collect the questions after the third talk.
Right, so I got
I will distribute.
It's two sheets.
Yeah.
Some mistake made, but it's,
Spot the mistake. That's
okay. Yes, that's.
So Professor Huoranszki, I think, is well known to many people here since he's a professor here at CEU and a professor of philosophy, and he's also a founding member of the CEU. And I would not list all these publications and specializations. I simply read out the title of his talk, which is Dreams of a Final Normative Theory. Why do they not search for utopia? And I'm going to distribute the handout.
Thank you very much, and thank you for organizing this and inviting me for this program. So what caught my attention about Utopia 25 years ago, when I was actually working on this political philosophy stuff, was a very striking fact about political philosophy. Most political philosophers, there are always exceptions, so we have to always have to be very careful about generalities. I wouldn't say everyone, but at least the majority of political philosophers I was familiar at the time, and I think it's still true today. Most of them try to kind of distance themselves from the idea that their political philosophy is actually a utopia, or it is utopistic. And what I wanted to understand why this is so. I mean, this is not at all obvious why it should be so, because political philosophy in general is a normative enterprise. Okay, so there is political science. Political scientists actually try to understand how the actual world, the actual political system operate, how different they are, etc. And there is also political philosophy on the other hand, which is a kind of normative enterprise. It's asking how, I mean, to use Rawls' famous expression, the basic structure of society ought to look, in order to be perfect, in order to be good. Something, it's a model for which actual political regimes should emulate. And this seems to be, very close to the idea what the utopian thinkers had. They wanted to formulate the conditions under which people can live together and flourish ideally. So there is a kind of natural affinity as far as the aims are concerned in utopian political philosophy. Of course, you can say such thing, and it's certainly true that many of the actual utopians were just the depictions of certain visions, and they were not bolstered by rational, strict arguments as philosophers try to do. But the fundamental aim is very similar, and it's not so obvious why political philosophers should constantly distance themselves from saying, no, we are not, what we are doing is normative, but it's not utopia. And so that's what I would like to want you to understand. And I make an attempt, okay, to say, probably there are other explanations, but I want to offer you one. So the first thing, just a very brief kind of technical conceptual distinction. I say that most contemporary political philosophy are anti-utopian. And I would like to distinguish this from dystopia. Okay, so this is a kind of delicate technical distinction. I introduced this, you will probably not find in the literature. But I think that there is a distinction. I'm not saying that the two are unrelated, but they are not the same, because I think that dystopia usually, the ones I'm familiar with, first of all, it's merely literature. It's not so much philosophy, I think, but what is much more important than this kind of distinction between the genres is that dystopia is really about actual history. Maybe it's like there is a kind of hypothetical aspect to it, but it's really about a kind of end state where history might lead if you don't care enough, or if you should be watch out, otherwise your system will lead to that state. Okay, and even if the idea is that the fundamental idea behind the state is something positive. If you are not careful enough, you end up with this kind of dystopic circumstances, which you can see every day when you look for a movie on the Netflix. So this is very, very kind of common genre today, and that's not what I have in mind. And I say anti-utopistic, I mean, you will see, I will make it more specific, a very specific theoretical attitude toward how to think normatively about political institutions, okay, and social institutions. So that's what I like to say. All right. So I would like to say then now something about democracy, because I just said political philosophy in general, but now I would move to the problem of democracy. Of course, given time limits, I will be super short about this, which is no problem, actually. Brevity can be a virtue. So here again, just as in the kind of political theory in general, we can draw a distinction. We can say that there is an actual empirical positive research about how the systems which we usually call democratic work. Okay, there are different systems operating different ways. There are different systems of elections, votings, parliaments, etc., and that's why comparative politics and other political scientists research. And there is, of course, a normative question, and the normative question is, if we really aspire for democracy, if you want to see regimes democratic, why this is so? So what is the ground? What is the normative ground? What justifies our desire, to use the term again, to live in the conditions of democratic institutions? Okay, so that's the question. That's the normative question then. And I would like to say is, and I think it's, I'm just assuming this, and this is a very brief and big assumption, but I will assume two things here about democracy, okay? The one thing is that democracy, what we mean by democracy, what we mean by democracy is a huge question, but what we mean by this democracy, I suppose, must have something to do with the majority, okay? How the majority will actually should be, or how it operates, how it should be installed. There are all kinds of differences, questions, etc., but I think democracy is a procedural concept. If you take this out of the concept of democracy, I don't think there is anything left. Okay. So that will be one of my assumptions. My other assumption will be that as far as the normative justification of democracy, that is democratic procedure, is concerned, it must something to do with the idea of equality. That has been already said. It goes back to the Greeks, but in fact, I think it's a mistake. But I'm not talking about this. Okay, just if you look at the Hunter, there is this note here. sentence in the bracket, and I say that this general approach to actually how to understand contemporary modern representative democracies based on the competitive party system, I think it's hopeless to understand this with reference to equality. That I think is a misunderstanding which goes back basically to Topia's work on the democracy in America when he is an aristocrat, so that America is egalitarian. And I think this is a misunderstanding, but this is a different story. Okay, let's go back to the utopia business. So I say that if it's democracy, then it's and we want normatively justified democracy, then it must something to do with equality. So the majority rule, we must strike a link between the procedure, which we call the majority rule, on the one hand, and the idea of the equality on the other. And this is not easy at all, I think. In fact, I believe it's more or less impossible, but there is just one aspect I would like to mention here, and this is that the fundamental difference between two interpretations of what we can call equality in a political setting. In one sense, we can say that when we want equality, then what we want is that everyone's, within one political community, of course, everyone's interests be represented in the same way. Okay, that everyone's interest should be not only represented, but all represented and satisfied to the same extent. That's one notion of equality. The other notion of equality is the more procedural one, which says that, well, when we make political decisions, everyone should have a more or less equal say, okay, in how the community will act and how what sort of collective decisions it makes about questions which concerns all members of the political community. Okay, so these are two different understandings of equality, and the problem is, I think, is the following. I mean, if you accept the first interpretation, namely that democracy is something which is good because it takes everyone's interest into account to the equal way, then it does not at all clear why egalitarianism in the other sense ought to be satisfied, or why you need it at all. Okay, if you already have a system which gives everyone equal chance to flourish in a community, everyone, why should, and it is possible, that's the important thing, that it is possible to design such a system, why you need the procedure in which everyone has an equal say in equal decisions. Okay, so that's the issue here. So what I would like to say is then that if I'm right and democracy has something to do with the majority and hence it has an essential procedural aspect, then democracy can only be justified with reference to the egalitarian idea that everyone should have an equal say. Actually, it's never satisfied in democracy. That's why I don't think that democracy is egalitarian, but that's another thing. So ideally, the idea is that it should be. Then, if you need this, only if you can't have a system in which everyone's interest is already satisfied. You can't live in conditions in which everyone's interest is already satisfied in an equal way. Because if you have one, that one, there is no point at all to have the procedural. You can't justify the procedural aspects of democracy. Now, so back to Utopia. I hope I still have 2-3 minutes to run this. Okay. So Okay, so that's democracy. So what's about utopia? So utopia, I think, is, as I said, a theory about the conditions in which everyone's interest is given an equal weight, which means that a system in which the application of majority rule cannot be justified. Okay, because there's already everyone is flourishing. So, and that would mean that if you do really believe that such conditions can exist, your project to give a normative justification of democracy understood as having the essential element of majority in it is deemed. Okay, there is no reason why you should justify. So that's okay. So that's what I think, or at least how I understood and I still understand why actually political philosophers are so cautious about being utopian and saying no, it's not utopian. Okay, it can go on. There are more technical issues here about how such normative systems are usually designed, but this is not based on these technicalities in political philosophy, at least some kind of political philosophy. What is the interesting question is that which is related to the concept of utopia, and which I would like to finish in 2 minutes. Fantastic, is that why this is so? So why people is so much convinced in these days that it is just impossible to have such conditions in which everyone interest can be given just equal weight, and everyone is flourishing, everyone is well off as much as one can be, and therefore there's no at all need for democracy and majority rule, etc., etc. And I think what I argued for once, and I would still insist on that there is a fundamental change in the way we understand the notion of flourishing, okay, or happiness in the modern age. In the old age, when it was the idea of eudaimonistic flourishing, happiness, that was the aim for all moral and political thinking. Okay, and some things change, and this is a big issue, how and why historically with us, and we are much less prone to think that what should guide our moral and political behavior is actual concern with happiness. Okay, I would say that's one way. It's a bit technical but short expression of the view I think is true, is that every utopia in terms of modern moral philosophy is by nature utilitarian in the classical sense. They want to maximize happiness, not just maximize, also distribute equally. That's a further issue. But they are happiness-based political thinkers. Whereas today, our age is, again, I'm using a somewhat technical expression, but I would say our age is basically Kantian, in the sense that we are interested in rights, each other's rights, and we are not supposed to directly care about each other's happiness. So we are very much upset about violation of rights, but the very concept of violating happiness doesn't make any sense. Okay, and we would say, okay, I mean, we might feel sorry, we might feel pity for it, but no one can come here and say, look, I need another system because I'm not happy. We can say, give me my rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, without much ado, I would like to introduce Professor Zoltán Balázs, who's going to be our third and last speaker on this panel. He's a professor of political science at the Corvinus University here in Budapest and also the Center for Social Studies. And his work has been on analytical political theory and literature, moral philosophy, conservatism, and the history of political thought. And I think that this topic, Utopia, might actually have might resonate with all of this. So the presentation is titled "The Time of Democracy," and I see there's also a subtitle, "A Political Theological Account."
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the invitation. Very much honored by that. Well, let's turn to the temporal issues related to utopian thinking. Time is a perplexing phenomenon. I don't know how many of you are interested in that. There are so many great YouTube videos on the cosmological problems and issues related to time. But I think that our metaphysical tradition has already knows the complexities. Ferenc's book, I read it in Hungarian. It has a great chapter on its problem of time. And I would like to add I'm not going to deal with cosmology or metaphysics, but political theology, which I think is also been very much concerned with the problem of time. Well, my talk is very rudimentary in nature, and I'm just giving you some hopefully meaningful food for thought. And my most slides are just meant to use to give you some quotations that are easier to read rather than hear. Now, this is the problem. A little bit long, kind of a long text, but I try to summarize on this slide three features of our political theological tradition related to thinking of time. The first is that God is supposed to be timeless, so he is not in time, he is outside of it. So, of course, talking about a timeless time makes rather little sense, but we understand that it is important to have someone who is out. It's possible to understand perhaps that someone is outside of time who is not to be supposed to be subjected to the passing of time. However, and this is we know that he created time, he is committed to it, therefore, and at least in the Christian tradition, God intervenes in history. It's also the Jewish tradition. God intervenes in history, and the Christian tradition tells us that in Jesus Christ, God also entered history directly and exited. And he, by Jesus Christ, in a way has become subject to a sort of time, which I call the eschatological time, which is meant to, in a way, meant to be a new kind of time that's related but not identical with the historical time that we live in. And that is the third sense of time, which I call the apocalyptical one. Because I will come to that, I will return to that in a few minutes. There is a third. There is in the Christian tradition, at least, Christ not only exited and has taken created eschatological time, but he is still struggling or waging a battle against evil, which defines, as far as I can see, the third type of time. Now, this is basically the three types of time, and my method is basically just to suggest to you that these three types of time have not only defined but have a constitutive role or constitutive role in an understanding of democracy. So the thesis is simply that mainstream liberal democracy conveys a hidden political theological message to its participants or perhaps inhabitants. This is what, in one sense, history has already been closed, that we are already living in a different time, in a sort of time, eternity, but not in timelessness. Now, let me begin with the first kind of time. I would like to announce that the end of history has indeed set in, not, however, in virtue of a grand historical event, such as the fall of communism, but by virtue of the very constitution of liberal democracy. Now, the first feature is that is thinking about constitutions and the importance of the concept of constitution. Everybody can remember that the first quotation is the preamble of the American Federal Constitution. We the people. This is not just, as far as I can see, a reference to the 39 signatories of the Constitution, but also an unintended reference to the royal plural, that is an agent without constraint, binding or perhaps creating the future by establishing an unchanging perpetual structure which is above or beyond laws, the changing norms of the historical existence of the polity. The people acts here like a creator, constituting the novus ordo seclorum. This entails a separation of the sovereign from historical time, although also binding the sovereign to history, that is a new sort of time. Remember the difference between the pre-constitutional times of Europe, in which the secular temporal rulers of the world were considered to be vicars of Christ, or perhaps catechons, to use Carl Schmitt's famous term, or Paul that he has taken from the Apostle Paul, the catechon who is postponing the fullness of time, the second coming of Christ. But anyway, in any case, the pre-constitutional times in Europe were considered to be historical times, basically. But we have, since the constitution of in our constitutional times, so to speak, we are already in some sort of a political eternity. If you add to this the famous definition, so to speak, or famous conception of perpetual peace, we read that besides the purity of its origin, the Republican Constitution, besides the purity of its origin, having sprung from the pure source of the concept of law, also gives a favorable prospect for the desired consequence, i.e., perpetual peace. Now, the subsequent reason that Kant gives is not at all convincing, honestly, because he refers to the risk-avoiding propensity of citizens, which is regrettably not the case. However, the very sentence that you can read here provides us with a more subtle and even perhaps some way of a mystical and more appropriate, by any case, a more appropriate hint to Kant's deeper conviction, which is that the Republican Constitution has a kind of a purity in its origin, which is related here to the concept, the pure of law. Thus, here again, we see how overcoming war, in other words, the history, and with it, the monotonous passing of time, is made possible by the act of transforming politics into constitutional government. Now, to see why and how constitutional democracy is utopia accomplished, in the sense of having overcome history and the presumed lamentable chain of wars and vicissitudes befalling mankind, let us just simply imagine the sudden end of the American Constitution. Just close your eyes and just imagine that suddenly the American Constitution ceases to exist. Now, I don't think that's just a cessation or the end of a great nation or the end of a superpower. It's the end of something more important, I claim. In his Gettysburg Address, Abraham Lincoln nailed it down with an almost prophetic insight, transposing the ongoing civil war into a theological context, when he said that the war would decide whether the government, you all know the phrase of by and for the people, would perish from the face of the earth. I think that such an event would have more far-reaching consequences than, as I said, just the end of a nation, or the fall, a decline, or a collapse of a nation. It would surely shake, or even put an end to the hopes of humanity, the hope that humanity has indeed succeeded in overcoming history and arriving in a safe harbor of different times. And all constitutions of the world would turn out to have been miserable imitations only of the divine providence. Now, this is just a thought experiment. It doesn't prove anything, but I think it just gives you, might give you a hint, or might give you a sense of how would we react to a post-constitutional world order. I think it's philosophically perhaps conceivable, but otherwise practically unthinkable. Now, the second feature, or the second type of time applies to democracy. Our constitutional time is not entirely timeless. Our political theological tradition, as I tried to point out, makes ample room for working with different times that coexist but not running on parallel tracks. The eschatological time in Christian theology has begun with the resurrection of Christ. But there is an ante and a post, a before and after in it. Though these tenses are distinct, they coexist, but they remain distinct. By Jesus' death, the rule of the Prince of the world has ended. Christ returned to the Father, and his eternal life as Jesus the Christ immediately began. I have some quotations that I simply skip here. In any case, the point is that when Christ resurrected, he commenced, so to speak, a new type of time. The time eternity, or the eternity cum time, in which historical past and present and future coincide but remain distinct forever. This distinction between historical and eschatological time has served as a model for the self-image of the Church, which exists both in history as ecclesia of militants and in the eschaton as the community of saints. Consequently, there is a distinction between historical and eschatological existence of every individual human soul. By baptism, by partaking in Christ's death, Christians are thought or believe they are resurrected to a new and eternal life. By our sinful nature, we are still, I'm talking in the name of a Christian, we are constantly endangered by death, falling back to historical and secular time. The glorification of the body will also occur with the new time as a separate event, not in the course of a chain of events, but as the final, in this sense, to occur event, a revelation of something that has already been accomplished by our baptism. Now, read the French 1789 French Constitution, the preamble of the which begins with the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. If you read this quotation, it might strike you, perhaps at the second read at least, that this text is really a baptismal text. It is a redemptive text. It is a declaration of the rebirth of mankind to its original condition of freedom and equality. Secondly, it names and renounces evil, all sorts of evil, ignorance, forgetfulness, and so on and so forth. Thirdly, it recognizes the necessity of salvation, that is to say, considering the risks that we are exposed to. And it makes a pledge never to return to the sinful state. We read the various verbs, resolution, declaration, verbs and nouns, resolution, declaration, being mindful of the future. Now, this kind of a baptismal eschatological text, so to speak, is, I think, a foundational text for most constitutions, for most democracies based on equality, as we have just heard. We know that the French revolutionaries even tried to begin the time anew with a new calendar. It was not very. It was a successful attempt, but what it has successfully created was a new sort of body, which I think is very much analogous to the resurrected body of Christ, and this is the body of the people. Now imagine, I just have an idea of how the elections, which define, might be taken as much the definitional feature of democracy as, for instance, the majority rule. The elections which just go and go and go. We are so much accustomed to the idea that elections just take place every fourth or the fifth or the second year. Will there be ever an event to the endless chain of elections? Why are elections so important? I think that they're important because they suggest not an early earthly time, but they are actually the recurrent apparitions of the redeemed people as a single body. The democratic soul craves for an experience with its own higher order reality. Elections are regular occasions for touching the eternal body of the people. Much as Christ's body has been united with the host by receiving, of which Catholic and Orthodox believers eat the bread of the new life, and much as the Church, the consummation of all sacraments, thought to be the body of Christ, casting the ballot is a semi-sacramental gesture, a reverse one, of course, as we are not eating from Christ's body, but emitting our own flesh, as it were, whereby the body of the people becomes tangible. Might be a wide idea, but you will tell your impressions. The third and last feature that I want to talk about is the apocalyptic time. Now, it's not easy to understand, and it's not very explicit in the Bible, perhaps, or in the New Testament. But you can find the traces of this thinking both in Paul and, of course, more explicitly and more exhaustively in John's Revelations. But I cite from Paul, who says in the first letter to Corinthians that Christ, when he has destroyed every sovereignty and every authority and power. There's a time that Christ's rule is going on. He reigns over the world. He must reign, Paul says, until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. So in one sense, Christ's rule is defined by struggling, by waging an apocalyptic, the word is really menacing, war against evil. So it's not just that Christ has done his work, resurrected and is with the Father, and is just waiting until his time, the second coming, arrives. But he is in a way working in this world. Of course, the apocalyptic battle takes place in individual souls. I just skip the parts in which I made some references to the tradition of apocalyptic thinking in apocalyptic terms. I think most of you can cite a number of examples of how such thinking has been prevalent in various stages of European history. And I just go to the two quotations that I think again are very interesting, even perhaps amazing. We see I think that there's a nice parallelism or analogy between the Revelation sentence about the Armageddon, the last battle, and the nations of the four corners of the earth will gather together for the battle to be fought against the forces of heaven. The Communist Manifesto with the famous or infamous sentence of the spectre haunting Europe and the various enemies of the communist revolution gathering together. Yes, I'm right at the end. So just a clarificatory sentence. So I think that the apocalyptic time is not past time, and we, notwithstanding the victory of the Prince of the World in the revolution, there's still work to do. Now, the victory has already won, but some battle is still going on. And this gives a very strange dynamic to all democracies. If you recall, leftist and rightist extremists today are constantly referring to their cause as the cause of democracy. Even in the middle, say the liberals and conservatives, are thinking that the democracy has to be defended, and then there are some evil, some sinister forces against democracy. I mean, this whole thinking of democracy to be defended is as an heir to the apocalyptic thinking of our general theological tradition. Even if they are not friend and foe, but foe between friends and enemies. But the basic concepts that I just proposed to think these basic antagonists, progress and reaction. So there is no very strict conclusion I can draw. It's just a very modest one. So these analogies, let's say the 3 times in theology being applied to the idea of to democratic thinking or thinking in democracy in temporal terms, if they are at least plausible, then we can see how the Western democratic theory and thinking is rooted in our political tradition, all connected to a peculiarly chronic understanding of politics. And it also becomes sensible why this thinking is and probably remains untranslatable into political regimes and cultures rooted in other religions. So I think that the last so to speak warning from my part is that if we understand democracy better, around democracy better, and its theological roots, then we can see why exporting democracy or why trying to explain our democracy to other countries, other cultures is so deeply difficult. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We invite Ferenc and Myrthe also across Zoltán to the table. Questions, comments?
May I have a question to Ferenc? When you said that democracy was essentially a procedural concept, or even said that if you take it out, there's nothing remains. And in my understanding, democracy is something really very complex, and I would emphasize the role of sociability, or the democratic society in which a solidarity exists amongst various members. So don't you think that this a little bit modifies this very sharp statement?
Yeah, thank you very much. Of course, the first thing I would like to say about this is that there is a problem with the very notion of democracy in these days, I think, because I think very often the very notion of democracy is used something which is politically normatively good. So when we say, what they done was not democratic, we are saying it was wrong. So so what I would like, and this is maybe just a philosopher's stance to this issue, but I would like to restrain the notions which we use to evaluate a political system or how should I put it, parse it properly. So, for instance, I don't think, though I know this is very contentious, but I don't think that, for instance, the issue of human rights, which is a key issue now in politics, world politics, but also often domestic politics, is an issue about democracy. I think it's about constitutionalism and liberal equality. That's a different notion. Now, there is a question whether or not liberal equality entails democracy or not. Okay, so this is not just automatically falls out, as it were, in my mind. Okay, and the same about solidarity. I think solidarity, yes, it is related to some kind of egalitarian ideal. You know, we are all people, actually, if you like, Christian egalitarian ideal. So it is obviously connected to both the idea of liberal equality and the idea of democracy somehow. But I think it's a different thing. So I think if you take out the procedural aspects of the notion of democracy, then you kind of dilute the notion so that it will be just used as, you know, a kind of good, acceptable, human, whatever political regime. Okay? So I think that I'm not against it or saying that solidarity, of course, I'm not against the idea that solidarity is an important aspect of a well-working political regime. But I don't think that those who believe, for instance, some kind of redistribution of goods on the ground of solidarity, that itself follows from anything which, so that it essentially follows from the requirements or concepts or expectations related to democracy. Okay, this is something else. Not all good things are the same. So that would be my answer. I don't know.
Further questions, though, of course, the speakers can also ask questions.
Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, I have two questions of both to and also to Zoltán. First is a question like I understand this.
I can hardly hear you.
Yeah.
One question. So I was always wondering what is the problem with these philosophers with democracy, and what you just presented as a projection seems to be some kind of attempt to hide the sociological problem behind philosophical essay, so that these people on the market are interested only in their own interests. So these people who are working for themselves, they are not part of a society or of friends or a network of friends. So maybe what we were just referring to was a sociological problem, that the demos was not part of this kind of club where you are looking for your friends and exchanging favors and so on. So it seemed to me that this was kind of project to give a justification, a more philosophical justification for excluding these people because they are not part of the club. And from my perspective, it seems to be a failed attempt to do so. And I'm really interested in your opinion about this, because what you just said about Skoria and other stuff seem to suggest that it's really not about leisure time. It is about being part of the club, having friends and doing things for your friends' sake. Something like, for example, Cicero said about, in a different context, about the very essence of politics and being liberal with other people. So this is my first question, and the other is to Zoltán, because I think that this analogy between biblical or theological understanding of time and the more secular time of democracy is very appealing in many ways. I have sometimes this feeling that if you think about these problems in terms of secularized theological concepts, then you can practically find these kinds of secularized things everywhere. If you are educated enough to know what to find there. So of course these were very interesting and very appealing examples you just mentioned in the presentation. On the other hand, in my innocence or in my naivety, I didn't find them there until you just pointed out that okay, you can read these texts in theological terms. So my question is how you can give some evidence that this kind of thinking is really there and not just one possible interpretation. I understand again, this is another big question for the discussion, but I was really impressed by your presentation. That's why they raised such big questions. Thank you.
Should I start?
Sure.
I think you are definitely right that it sort of boils down to a sociological analysis. So I'm not sure that I would say that they're not sort of part of the club, but the fact that the demos has a kind of occupation that takes most of their time, and that at least according to these more elite thinkers doesn't involve a kind of virtue that you need to rule a community, and they draw from that the conclusion that it's better to exclude those people because they are not they are not somehow trained through their daily activities to take into account a longer term perspective or the perspective that goes beyond having enough money for one day, because if you were paid at the end of the day, you were. So the sort of moral assumption seems to be that if you live under such circumstances, you cannot do the things that citizenship requires of you. And they draw from that the conclusion that it's better to exclude those people so that at least the city doesn't make any bad decisions. And of course, there are plenty of bad decisions that, Plato, for instance, thought that the Athenians made, and not only Plato, in wars where they got dragged into breaking truce that they had concluded with Sparta, and then as a result they lost the war. So it's very clear that, or at least in their mind, what they saw as the failure of democracy is that it sort of includes in citizenship a lot of people who are not sort of qualified or equipped to take these kind of decisions. So, and their conclusion is, what I suppose we would not want to support, is that those people should not be citizens. But so what I was trying to do is to say that if we take the alternative route, not exclude them, but raise them to the level that they are equipped to. So I thought that seems to be the other way that you could go, which they did not, for whatever reason, go. I suppose one of the reasons might be that in their terms, then it's not a democracy anymore, because the demos consists of the lower classes who are wage laborers. If they have that kind of security, they wouldn't call it a demos anymore. But then it would be more like a democracy in our. I mean, I think that they use a very moral kind of reasoning that we are not really used to, because we tend to think in terms of rights. But I wonder that if we do bring these kind of moral considerations about what enables people to be citizens in the discussion, how that might change the discussion, because there are moral arguments all the time made, but not recognized to be so. So, for instance, as far as I've read, for instance, Joseph Stiglitz wrote that in the Price of Inequality, that the American government, after the financial crisis, decided to give the trillions of dollars without any kind of accountability to the banks, not to the people who were the victims. And this is a moral choice, because it means that they thought it was more risky to give it to the people who needed it than to the banks who had used the credit. And this is a moral choice, but I think it's often sold as some kind of rational decision, which it's not. So, I mean, what I was trying to suggest is that if you use these ancient theories, you have to sort of, but then in the alternative direction, as it were, you have to come to the conclusion that inequality and people who do not have enough for their daily subsistence is cutting at the roots of what democracy is for us, at least.
Well, thank you very much for your questions, Ron. I really appreciate that. Well, each of us has, in a way, addressed the issue of thinking of how to think about democracy. So Ferenc had suggested to think in terms of justice, rights, equality, happiness. That was a vocabulary he used, and we have just listened to how to use Aristotle to understand our own relation to our thinking of democracy. But I was just doing this once the topic of this discussion was, or this workshop was to reflect on utopia, and it's not a new thing that I've already been doing this for some time. To think that democracy is just a period of history, and I believe that on that point, Tocqueville always said that it's not just a system; it's an age, an aion, so to speak. Then we should understand democracy in the broadest possible terms. So why not use political theology? I'm not saying that you can reduce our thinking of democracy into, or reduce to its political theological, so to speak, context or whatever tradition. But I think that there is that it is a possibility, and there are analogies which are real. That's to say, that's part and parcel of how we are being raised, so to speak. And I think that not many of us, think that democracy has a horizon or a perspective of temporality. But it really perplexes me why we tend to think that democracy has no end. I mean, elections, the incessant flow of elections coming in. Is it an interesting feature of democracy, or the Constitution? Constitutions are just out there, right? They are sometimes subject to the change. But can you imagine an unconstitutional way of existing for ourselves? And these are the questions that I think that could be related to the problem of utopia. And my preliminary suggestion, so to speak, was that we are living in utopia, at least in Uchronia, a very strange, but at the same time very traditional. Very strange sense, based on our theological thinking. Even if we are not believers, we don't think of that. But we, for instance, don't think that free will has a very specific philosophical. Again, I'm just pointing to Ferenc, who's an expert on that. So I don't exactly think that other cultures would understand immediately and without any problems our concept of free will. We understand that, even if we don't think that it has very, very geologically speaking, philosophical and theological roots. But I know you sort of understand each other very easily. But thank you for your question. I mean, this method, how to think about utopia, is at the same time a very, very interesting methodological question that we can perhaps discuss later.
Questions?
May I have one more question to Zoltán? Because as you spoke about the US Constitution and the Declaration of the Rights of Man, it's basically sacred text. I was wondering if that's an analogy, and maybe we don't need to push it so far, but is the analogy of divine inspiration also present in those texts? And once you talk about them in theological terms, aren't the revolutions are also some sacred moments of secular redemption. So
definitely, yes. So the answer to the last question is definitely yes. Yes, especially since the French Revolution was in many ways the birth of a new religion, very explicitly so, right? Whereas Robespierre was just acting as a high priest of a new religion, so there was no question about the sacramental nature of the revolution. If you read Rousseau, I mean, there's just the evidence is I'm talking about the civil religion and his whole idea of the people elevated to the status of a divine agent. Who is incorruptible? I mean, cannot err. I don't know, all sorts of divine properties are being assigned to attributed to the people. So definitely yes.
Yeah, I have a question. Would you then say that representative democracies of modernity, particularly the USA, this bicameral parliament, arguably an attempt to accommodate Aristotle's guidance on necessity of the rule of the one per few and the many at different times, would you then say that they successfully tackle the issue of disproportionate impact made by unfit masses as identified by Plato? If so, then to what degree? If not, then to what degree is it? Is the phrasing bad?
Is this a question for me?
Yes.
Sorry, can you just repeat, because it's not very.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a long sentence, I'm sorry. Would you then say that representative democracies of modernity, particularly the USA, with its bicameral parliament, arguably an attempt to accommodate Aristotle's guidance on necessity of the rule of the few, the many, and the one at different times, do they then successfully tackle the issue of disproportionate impact made by unfit masses, as identified by Plato, which you were mentioning? And if they do successfully tackle the issues, to what degree? If not, then where do they think?
That's a big question. Well, I mean, first of all, I think that many, let's say, regimes that we now call democracies wouldn't really be democracies in the ancient sense. So, I mean, because many countries like the UK or the Netherlands, they have a parliament and a senate and a monarch in some cases, and then also referenda. So I would be tempted to say that those might almost be more like what is called a mixed constitution. So a constitution which with elements like that combines the element of monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. What they do manage to avoid is, of course, what Plato saw in Athens happening was that there could be certain demagogues who gained a lot of traction, and then in a powerful speech could persuade the assembly to vote for yes or no, let's say, because there was they didn't just. There would need to be a defense on both sides of the issue. So someone would argue, okay, yes, we are now going to attack this particular city in war, and someone else would vote against it. And then there are these cases where the demos changes its mind the next day. So those kind of very impulsive events in the political arena are obviously sort of mitigated by a representative democracy, because there is just not the kind of setting in which, you know, the citizens would come together and say, okay, we are now going to war. I mean, this is a much more complicated discussion. So some of the pitfalls that people like Plato saw can be avoided in that way by setting up a representative democracy. Of course, that comes with its own problems, you might say, because there may be people who don't feel represented. But that would require some more imagination about how they would respond to those kind of problems. I don't know whether that goes towards an answer to your question.
Thank you. Hazard a final question to me.
I'm really out of my element here, but I'm going to ask about some antique Greek political theory. And I wonder if you could speak a bit about this transformation from the concept of isonomia to democracy. I read a text in the the democracy entry that this was sort of a preceding concept, which had much more sort of equality among noblemen as its main concept, but then it sort of preserved economic inequality. Whereas democracy, the sort of equality shifts to, sort of broad mass in political terms, but still preserves economic inequality. And I wonder if in your own research you've come across this sort of conceptual shift.
I'm not sure that there is a sort of conceptual shift from, that you can really speak about a conceptual shift from isonomia to democracy. Isonomia literally means that everyone is equal in front of the law. So if you have a private person, regardless of their wealth, is going to be charged under the same terms for the same kind of offense. So we are not going to, treat people who have more wealth in a different way than a person who doesn't have that kind of wealth. And whereas democracy means like, so also the demos has citizen status, and that means that they have access to political offices, they can speak in the assembly, they would be chosen by lot to be part of the council that sort of prepares the assembly. They could go to the popular courts, to the judicial functions. So I don't really think that you can talk about a shift. I mean, isonomia might be a term that especially Democrats would, value or treat as a core value, like isonomia and iseguria. So everyone has the same right to speak. It's not just the more wealthy people or the people who have higher social status or who come from the noble families who are allowed to speak. And this is clearly something that the Athenians thought of themselves as very distinctive of them in regard to, for instance, Sparta. I mean, it's not that, so within a democracy, it can be one of the central values, but I don't think that you could really say that it somehow shifts.